Each ACS chapter is unique and offers its members ways to learn more and do more to help cetaceans. Monthly public presentations, newsletters, and research grant awards are offered. The Los Angeles chapter has been conducting a gray whale census from Point Vicente for 37 years. Chapter activities have been abbreviated during the pandemic, but chapters have continued to stay involved with cetacean-related issues. The American Cetacean Society is excited to introduce Gianna Minton, Ph.D.'s talk on networking for endangered cetaceans, pulling expertise, resources, and local capacity for cetacean conservation. This presentation will describe collaborative efforts to promote the conservation of endangered Arabian Sea humpback whales in Oman and the wider Arabian Sea region, endangered Irrawaddy dolphins in Sarawak, and the critically endangered Atlantic humpback dolphins along the west coast of Africa. Gianna Minton started her career in the field of education, but was so inspired by Oman's marine environment during her 8 years there that she started a new career in marine mammal research and conservation. Gianna has a Ph.D. focusing on the unique non-migratory humpback whales of the Arabian Sea, and has conducted field-based research in Oman, Malaysia, and Gabon. After 18 years of fieldwork and research in these diverse tropical locales, she is now based in the Netherlands, where she continues to collaborate with colleagues in her 3 former homes, and is involved with cetacean conservation projects with WWF, the IWC, and the IUCN. Gianna is a member of the IUCN Marine Conservation Committee, the IUCN WCPA Marine Mammal Protected Areas Task Force, and is Deputy Chair of the IUCN Cetacean Specialist Group.
Thanks for being here. Appreciate it. So you already had the whole introduction. We don't need to bring up the entire CV. So I think it's wonderful. I love the transition from educator to what you do now. It's just phenomenal. So I can't wait to hear from them. So I will basically just step out of the screen here shortly. Let me just see if you can, I'll just ask you now just to share your screen, and I will mute myself.
I will be talking to you today about endangered cetaceans in 3 different locations and ways that people, individuals, and organizations have collaborated to try and help protect them. I thought it would be useful to give a little bit of an overview of how the talk will be structured so that you know where we are in the talk as we go along. We'll start with some disclaimers, and then we'll talk about Arabian Sea humpback whales in Oman and beyond. Then we'll move across to the island of Borneo, where we'll talk about collaborative efforts to protect Irrawaddy dolphins, as well as humpback dolphins and finless porpoise in Sarawak, Malaysia. Then we'll zoom across to the west coast of Africa, where we'll talk about a really exciting new collaborative effort to protect humpback dolphins, Atlantic humpback dolphins. And then we'll finish up with a few lessons learned along the way. So let's start with the disclaimers. What I'm about to talk about is not rocket science. I'm going to be talking more about the human dimension of collaborations and not so much about the ins and outs of the research and the science. So it's going to be a little bit subjective. It's also not particularly novel. There are fantastic collaborations happening all over the world for different species of cetaceans and in different settings, and they're great examples of how people can work together. But when thinking about what I could talk to you about today, I thought it would be a good idea to focus on a few species and settings that might not be so familiar to most of you. So what I'm going to talk about is led by my own personal experience, but really it reflects the input and expertise and thinking and collaboration of so many people. Here are just a few of those people from the Arabian Sea Whale Network, from the Sarawak Dolphin Project, and from this exciting new collaboration for Atlantic humpback dolphins. I wish I could name them all, but it would probably take up my full slot. So hopefully you recognize some of them. And if you're listening in the audience, you know I love you. And thanks for everything that we've done together. Most importantly, I'd like to emphasize that this is still a work in progress with a lot for us to learn, in particular with regards to ensuring more equal and meaningful participation of local stakeholders in all aspects of conservation. So let's dive right into our first endangered cetacean, the Arabian Sea humpback whale. This subpopulation of whales form the focus of my PhD work, and as such, I may dwell on this species a little bit longer than the other two, and I hope you'll indulge me. The tagline of this conference is looking at the history of whale science. So I thought it would be good to involve a little bit of the history of Arabian Sea humpback whales here. Historical humpback whale wisdom tells us that southern hemisphere populations of humpback whales feed in the Southern Ocean between December and April and breed in tropical areas south of the equator between June and October each year. Northern hemisphere populations, on the other hand, feed in temperate and subpolar waters in the northern hemisphere here and breed in tropical areas just north of the equator. The two should not come in contact. So how does one explain a series of historical sightings that have been made of Arabian seas in the humpback whale, in the humpback whales in the Arabian Sea, an area well north of the equator, but with no feasible migration routes to northern feeding grounds? This puzzled people for a long time. In 1991, a few researchers put their heads together and examined all the available records of humpback whales from the northern Indian Ocean. And because there were records from almost every month of the year in the Gulf of Aden and in Oman and the Arabian Gulf, they were the first to postulate that perhaps there might be a resident population of humpback whales in the Arabian Sea. They also proposed that the mechanism that might allow whales to feed and breed in the same area rather than performing long migrations was the phenomenal upwelling that occurs in the Arabian Sea during the southwest monsoon. Here you can see two images that show what happens to sea surface temperatures during the southwest monsoon. In May, you've got temperatures that you would expect at tropical latitudes of 30 degrees Celsius or higher. And in August, when that monsoon's in full force, temperatures close to the shore can drop to as low as 15 degrees Celsius. And this kicks off a whole chain of productivity and is able to provide the kinds of food that whales need to be able to feed in these latitudes. And it can create a phenomenon of what we might call lazy whales. This was pretty much a theory until 1997, when one of the scientists who had been active on the Soviet whaling fleets that whaled in the Southern Ocean, but passed through the Suez Canal on their way to the Southern Ocean. He reported that in between 1964 and 1966, the fleet had taken thousands of whales in the Arabian Sea, including 242 humpback whales off the coasts of Oman, India, and Pakistan. He also reported that of the 238 whales that were examined by the scientific team on the ship in November 1966, over 45% of the females were pregnant, over 50% had full stomachs and had been eating sardines and euphausids or krill. None of the whales had the cookie cutter scarring that's typical of whales that feed in the Southern Ocean. And all of the adults were on average larger than those that had been hunted in the Southern Ocean. So Yuri Mikolev, who's pictured here, and here's one of the vessels that had been involved in that whaling expedition, he proposed that the whales in the Arabian Sea adhered to a northern hemisphere breeding cycle, mating between January and May, and with a peak feeding along that occurred with the seasonal upwelling between June and September. So what did this information do to inspire research in the region? Well, in 1994, a very informal volunteer group had formed already to respond to whale strandings and entanglements. They called themselves the Oman Whale and Dolphin Rescue Group. But the publication of the data from the Soviet whaling, along with some sightings that had been made during seismic observations in the Gulf of Mazira, inspired the team to up their game a little bit. And we begged and borrowed and stole, well, okay, maybe we didn't actually steal, but we did a lot of begging and a lot of borrowing to get ourselves a boat and the equipment and supplies that we needed to begin some really dedicated cetacean surveys. So here you can see the boat that was donated to us. We had all kinds of sponsors who provided anything from life jackets to fuel for the boats and vehicles to transportation to tins of beans and bags of nuts that we would eat while we were in the field. And we were able to use this support and our volunteer efforts and the permissions that were granted by the relevant authorities to conduct photo identification, genetic sampling, acoustic monitoring, spatial assessment, and passive abundance and relative abundance of the whales off the coast of Oman. These first 6 years of research revealed some pretty interesting things. We were able to identify some core habitat of the humpback whales in this area in the south of the country called Dhofar, in the middle of the country here in the Gulf of Mazira. We were able to conduct photo identification and use mark recapture models to estimate the abundance of the whales, which was estimated to be fewer than 100 animals off the coast of Oman. The biopsies that we took and the genetic analysis that was performed in collaboration with institutes across the seas helped to prove that this was possibly the world's most isolated and distinct population, that whales were no longer breeding with those in the southern hemisphere and that they had probably diverged about 70,000 years prior to the time that we started our research. Together, this evidence helped to convince the assessors that this population of humpback whales in the Arabian Sea should be designated as endangered on the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. We were kind of proud of ourselves. We thought this isn't bad for a ragtag bunch of volunteer scientists who've been doing work on a shoestring. But we also knew that this model for research and conservation was not a sustainable one. So it was fantastic news in 2004 when the Environment Society of Oman came into being. This was formed by a group of over 40 Omani founding members. And although the whale team had been involved in the efforts to found the organization, everyone involved in these efforts realized that it would be much better to give the organization a wider environmental remit to look at all aspects of wildlife and nature conservation. And the foundation of the Environment Society of Oman was really a landmark. From that point forward, fundraising became much more professional, and all of the conservation and research efforts were put into a framework that was owned and guided by local stakeholders. And from that point forward, research was conducted under this umbrella. And it's been fantastic to see how the research has developed over the years. The team that's in place there now is engaged in some really exciting work, including satellite tagging and habitat modeling throughout the Arabian Sea area here, as well as using drones to conduct visual health assessments and body condition assessments. So things in Oman were really exciting, and we were learning a lot about the whales on that side of the Arabian Sea. But there were so many questions about what was happening on the other side of the Arabian Sea, where we knew the Soviets had also taken a large number of whales. And we were also extremely worried because we knew that threats were proliferating throughout the Arabian Sea. These threats included a rapidly expanding fisheries using large mesh coastal gill nets throughout the entire region, as well as the expansion and construction of ports and increased vessel traffic throughout the Arabian Sea. So we knew that we needed to work in a more collaborative way if we wanted to help this whale population and really address the threats that it faced. So a few visionary people pulled together a meeting of, I think there were 27 people involved in this first meeting in January 2015 in Dubai. And there were people from most of the range states involved for Arabian Sea humpback whales, as well as a group of supporting biologists and experts from other international organizations. The meeting was funded and supported by Emirates Wildlife, WWF, and the Marine Mammal Commission. And what was discussed over those 3 or 4 days of those meetings and the priorities that were set out for the conservation of the population inspired people so much that they decided to form a network that would have permanent presence and keep everybody in touch with each other and further the collaboration between these individuals and others over time. So the Arabian Sea Whale Network is an informal network. It doesn't have any legal status or standing, and it's open to anyone who is conducting whale research and conservation in the region. The flagship species is the Arabian Sea humpback whale, but the group collaborates on all aspects of large whale conservation and even dabbles in some small cetacean conservation issues from time to time. Members include experts and conservationists in 10 different Arabian Sea range states, and also expert advice and support from international organizations like the International Whaling Commission, the Marine Mammal Commission, the Convention on Migratory Species, for example, and their WWF offices throughout the region as well as internationally involved. As if to confirm how important it was going to be to collaborate in this regional scale, it was really fantastic to see that shortly after the foundation of the Arabian Sea Whale Network, a whale that had been tagged off the coast of Oman in the Gulf of Mazira proceeded to move all the way across the Arabian Sea to the southwest coast of India, spent a few weeks around the southern tip of India, and then she proceeded to track all the way back to almost exactly the same position where she had been tagged 17 weeks earlier. This event brought teams in Oman and India together as they shared information, and the team in India went out and searched for Luban, and it really helped to motivate and solidify the collaboration within the network. Another thing that gave a boost to network members and helped to foster collaboration was a workshop that was held in 2019 to help identify important marine mammal areas in the Southwest Indian Ocean and Arabian Seas. A number of the areas that were identified, and you heard Eric talk about the importance of IMAs earlier today, a number of the areas that were identified were chosen, delineated specifically because of their importance for Arabian Sea humpback whales. So a few regional initiatives that have taken place under the ASWN include a website, which you can peruse at your leisure. It includes news and information and also resources that members of the network can use, download and use. We have an email forum, which includes, I think, close to 70 people now. And on that forum, we regularly share information and events and advice and support. There have been a couple regional training workshops, one on stranding and entanglement response in Oman in 2015, and one to introduce a new online data platform in Oman in 2018. And this is a regional online data platform that's been developed in collaboration with flukebook.org. The network has also worked collaboratively together towards a regional conservation management plan. In 2017, the Convention on Migratory Species endorsed a concerted action for Arabian Sea humpback whales, and now everyone is working together with the International Whaling Commission to convert that into a regional management plan that involves governments and their support. But some of the most exciting things that happen within the network don't necessarily happen because of it. They happen more because of the tireless efforts of the members in their own countries and their own settings. For example, in Oman, you now have an effective national NGO and a government-led stranding network, and both of these organizations are engaged in education and outreach to coastal communities and industry. In India, there's a growing network, a growing national team of young scientists who are engaged in all forms of cetacean research, including acoustic monitoring for Arabian Sea humpback whales. And they have a national database of sightings and strandings that's publicly accessible. In Pakistan, WWF Pakistan has been leading a crew-based observer program where fisheries crews are reporting humpback whale sightings as well as other species, and this valuable data is being used to justify the creation of new marine protected areas. In Iran, there's an NGO, Plan for the Land, that fosters a national stranding network, and they do some amazing awareness-raising activities in coastal communities throughout the country. All of the members contribute to regular regional updates, and they submit annual reports to the Scientific Committee of the International Whaling Commission. These reports have led to some small research grants, which further foster collaboration. And again, most of these things don't happen because of the network. They happen because of the individuals and their dedication within the network. But I think it would be fair to say that a lot of the network members feel that their work is supported and strengthened, and also gains a wider visibility through the collaboration that we have on a regional and international scale. So because the sub-theme of this conference is history, I thought it might be interesting to look at these milestones that we just talked about in a timeline format. And I'm not going to highlight each item on the timeline, but it's perhaps interesting to look at the two sides of the timeline and to think about the milestones that were achieved in terms of research and data collection. Certainly those have driven forward different movements within the conservation effort. As we learn more about the whales, we're more effectively able to think of ways to protect them. But that doesn't mean a lot if you don't have the institutional support on the other side of the timeline. We need the governments within the countries of range states to support research and conservation efforts. And we need international recognition as well of the importance so that regional collaboration can take place. And in this respect, there's actually still a lot of work to do. We need to better figure out ways to involve industry and government in conservation actions so that we can effectively mitigate the threats that are facing this endangered population. We'll come back to that in the lessons learned section at the end of the talk. But for now, let's move on to the next species. In 2005, after living and working for 8.5 years in Oman, I moved to Sarawak, a state of Malaysia on the northwest corner of the island of Borneo. Armed with a fairly newly obtained Ph.D. and buoyed by the successful foundation of the Environment Society of Oman, I was eager to work with another NGO, and I was convinced that working with an NGO would be the most effective way to contribute to cetacean conservation in my new home. For almost 2 years, I engaged in discussions with an international NGO that was well established in Sarawak and seemed keen to start a dolphin research and conservation project. But frustratingly for me at the time, the NGO eventually concluded that they needed to concentrate on terrestrial conservation issues and that they couldn't venture into the marine area. But they did help to broker a new collaboration for the project. And it was a kind of surprising one. Shell, and I mean Shell, the oil company, they had agreed to fund the project, and they prepared to give us quite a generous grant. And because Shell also funded an environmental chair position at the University of Malaysia, Sarawak, they were keen for the university to play a leading role in the dolphin project. And both Shell and the university were keen to involve the Sarawak State Forestry Corporation because they felt it was important that the government agency responsible for conservation was also involved in these efforts. The chair of the environmental department picked his most promising student, Cindy Peter, to be the key point person on the project, and boy, am I ever glad he did. Over the next 2 years, the partnership led to the training of 3 local master's students, hands-on training in boat-based cetacean survey methods and stranding response for over 30 park rangers and government agency representatives. And we conducted multiple workshops for coastal communities. And this is an area where Cindy was really able to shine. She was able to connect with rangers, with children, with fishermen alike. And it was really exciting to see how this project began to blossom. And it also had full government buy-in and support, as well as involvement of industry, which was unexpected, but really positive. The investment from those initial 3 partners who had worked under the MOU for the first 2 years sort of snowballed, and it allowed the project to grow and recruit more staff, and also to obtain funding from further organizations. So we had funding from Ocean Park, for example, from the National Science Foundation in Malaysia. And we formed partnerships with, for example, an eco resort in the Kuching area, and a local fishing community where a fisherman retrofitted his boat with a viewing platform so that we were able to effectively add some new methods to our work. We were able to effectively conduct photo identification, line transect, and we also began conducting fisheries interviews with the coastal communities, fishing communities where we worked. And this was fantastic because it meant that the project was grounded in the local communities and local settings where we were working. Those first few years of the project led to a number of peer-reviewed publications. They're tiny here, you don't have to look at them all, but you can see that a number of them were authored by those MSc students who completed their MSc theses. They helped to define the habitat, the core habitat of the three main species that were present. And those were the Irrawaddy dolphins, the Indo-Pacific humpback dolphins, and the finless porpoises. And yes, these are finless porpoises, not just tires floating in the water, which they often look like. They're frustrating to work with sometimes, but very important to protect. So we had peer-reviewed publications, and more importantly, perhaps, the work that we did contributed to state Ramsar site management plans and other local management plans, as well as the identification of two important marine mammal areas in Sarawak. But perhaps the most exciting thing that came out of this project has been the cascading capacity building on a local scale. So I told you about Cindy. In 2015, she'd been presenting at a number of conferences in different settings. But in 2015, she won the Leatherwood Award at the Society for Marine Mammalogy's biennial conference. And that, together with her publications and other accolades, earned her a position as a university lecturer at the University of Malaysia, Sarawak. And that position has allowed her to cascade her knowledge and her expertise to a whole new generation of potential cetacean scientists in Sarawak. It's led to more peer-reviewed publications. She's had 11 undergraduate students who've had projects focusing on dolphin research and conservation issues. She participates in statewide conservation planning, and she's a member of the Sarawak Marine Mammals Stranding Task Force. She participates in regional research networks and publications. She's now a member of the board for the Society of Marine Mammalogy. And perhaps most excitingly, her MSc student, Sam, who you see pictured here, is about to submit her first manuscript to a peer-reviewed journal. And that focuses on the interaction of the species that we talked about with fisheries in the region, which is really critical to thinking about how to protect these species from the threats in the region. So well, let's see where that project goes next. I'm really, really excited. But for now, we're going to move on to the next species. We're going to zoom across to the west coast of Africa here, a bit like I did in 2012. And we're going to focus on the critically endangered Atlantic humpback dolphin, a species with a very interesting history and, unfortunately, a very uncertain future. Atlantic humpback dolphins are a member of the genus Sousa, which includes the pink dolphins you may have seen or heard about on the coast of Hong Kong, Sousa chinensis. It also includes an Indian Ocean species, Sousa plumbea, named for its lead-gray coloration, and a relatively newly described Australian species, Sousa sahulensis. Okay, so now you're going to wait for me to know how do you pronounce this name here of the Atlantic species. I say Sousa tutsi, but I can guarantee you that there are a lot of other pronunciations out there. And to get the right one, you probably need to talk to a German speaker, because the species was first scientifically described in 1892 by a guy named Willy Kokenthal. And he based his description on a specimen that was recovered from a mangrove channel in Cameroon. The stranded animal had a stomach full of mangrove leaves, which were presumably somehow ingested during the dolphin's desperate last few days as it was stranding in a mangrove channel. But based on the stomach contents, Mr. Kokenthal published his description as the first known vegetarian cetacean species. Well, most of you know that that's probably not a very logical conclusion to draw, but somehow he got it published, and there's a little interesting bit of history for you. Since Willy's time, we've learned a lot more about the species. We know, for example, that it's restricted to shallow water habitats that can include mangrove areas as well as open sandy coastlines. We also know, or we suspect, that fewer than 3,000 individuals are thought to remain in the species' entire range, which encompasses more than 7,000 kilometers from Western Sahara here in the north to Angola in the south. Now, 3,000 may sound like a lot, but in actual fact, these animals are dispersed in tiny little pockets of populations that are small and isolated and always restricted to these nearshore areas. So each population is probably isolated from the next, unable to be in contact or replenish a population if somehow it's depleted. And it's almost certain that it will be depleted because there are so many threats in the region. The species is also very poorly understood. We have confirmed records from 13 of the 19 countries in its suspected range, but in those other 6 countries where we don't have records, we're not sure whether it's because the species was there and has been extirpated because of threats that were present in the region, or whether it never was there in the first place, or whether there are perhaps thriving populations that no one has documented because there haven't been any dedicated cetacean survey efforts yet. So there's still a lot to be learned, and time is running short because there's so many threats that this species faces. As with the previous 2 species that we talked about, gill nets and local artisanal fisheries present the greatest threat. Most of the fishing that takes place in the region takes place from vessels like these from Ghana, pictured here in the upper left-hand corner. They're open-deck motorized boats that predominantly use gill nets, like this gill net here. And these are cheap and easy to deploy, relatively cheap and easy to deploy, but they're also fantastic at tangling dolphins, like this poor Atlantic humpback dolphin calf here. And the issue of bycatch for this particular species is further complicated because the meat has value either for human consumption or for use as bait in lucrative shark fisheries. And because this meat has value, it sometimes motivates direct hunting of the species as well. Another issue for this species is the fact that the population in this part of the world is rapidly growing. And you can see from this map of Western Africa here how populations are really densely concentrated in the coastal areas. There's a lot of port construction and other coastal development throughout the species range. And wherever these things are constructed, they introduce, as Eric was talking about, barriers to longshore movement and to hunting and socializing and other important activities for the species. And they can also introduce contaminants or increase the turbidity or increase underwater noise, which can all affect the population's health as well as their feeding and socializing opportunities. It's not that we don't know anything about this species. There have been a few punctuated, really valuable efforts to study and protect the species, starting with efforts in the early 2000s, which were regional and which involved local scientists and really helped to elucidate some of what was happening with the species. And then there have been some recent review papers as well, summarizing all of our current knowledge and understanding of the species. So that there is some good science happening, but I think there's a general consensus that we don't know enough. And more importantly, what we do know hasn't yet been converted into any effective conservation efforts and activities on the ground. A few things have highlighted this at a global scale recently. The first was the 2017 uplisting of the species from vulnerable to critically endangered on the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. In that same year, the Convention on Migratory Species endorsed a concerted action for Atlantic humpback dolphins. In 2018, the Nuremberg Zoo hosted a workshop which was motivated by a number of scientists who'd been involved with the efforts to save the vaquita, which, as many of you may know, now numbers, people think, perhaps even fewer than 10 individuals. People involved in the efforts to save the vaquita were truly alarmed at how quickly the species declined. It seemed to reach a tipping point, and now we don't know whether it will be possible to bring the animals back from the brink of extinction. And so these scientists wanted to try and get ahead of the curve and look out for the next species that might be in danger of following that same trajectory if urgent conservation action was not taken. And Atlantic humpback dolphins were named among the 7 species that were most likely to follow that trajectory and were in urgent need of conservation intervention. The International Whaling Commission, in its scientific committee meetings, had been making recommendations about the species for many years, and in 2019, they formed an Africa-focused SUSA task team, which obviously had a strong element focusing on Atlantic humpback dolphins. All of these initiatives together inspired a group of people to come together and form the Consortium for the Conservation of Atlantic Humpback Dolphins. The partners in this consortium have the collective goal of trying to move conservation for the species beyond talk and planning and into the realm of concrete action. Like the Arabian Sea Whale Network, it's an open, informal collaboration. It doesn't have formal legal status. And most important is that any members who want to join are really ready to get their hands dirty and dig in and contribute to the effort. So the CCAHD was formed in 2020. It now has a website, which is susatutsi.org. There are over 60 members, and the number is growing, and that includes members from 13 of the 19 range states. It includes independent scientists, local and national NGOs, international NGOs, IGOs, people who work at MPAs, government agencies, and more. And they're all grouped together with the mission statement of working towards the long-term sustainability of Atlantic humpback dolphins populations and their habitats through research, awareness, capacity building, and action. It's been amazing to see how everyone has come together and donated their time and expertise, and in some cases, materials like acoustic equipment. UCO has donated this fantastic regional marine mammal identification guide with his beautiful illustrations, and other people have illustrated coloring sheets and other educational materials. And everyone has donated a lot of expertise and time by working in working groups to help identify the priorities that are required for conservation of this species. This draft report that identifies the top priorities for conservation action is now under review, and we hope that it will guide further fundraising efforts. We have a few grants already, but really much more funding and support is needed to implement all of the recommendations that are made in this report. And as I said, time is running short for this species. So we hope very much that we'll be able to fundraise effectively and implement our plans. And that leads nicely into some of the lessons learned from all 3 of these different situations that I've described. I'd like to emphasize that some of these lessons are really particular to the settings that I talked about today and may not apply in the United States or other areas where values and funding opportunities and so forth are different. But in all 3 of the settings that I described here today, one of the key challenges is that recruiting to the cause is not always easy. So in some countries, governments, universities, and even some NGOs do not necessarily prioritize cetacean conservation when they've got other pressing matters to deal with. And this is perhaps truer now than ever during the pandemic. In many countries, there are cultural barriers to fieldwork. For example, in some settings, it may be difficult for women to engage in fieldwork that involves traveling unaccompanied by family members. And at the same time, some young men and women may be put off working in cetacean research because it's known that it's a career that's not likely to offer the kind of financial stability that being a doctor or an engineer or even a fisheries scientist would offer. Being a cetacean scientist and offering cetacean conservation programs is not necessarily a moneymaker for institutions or individuals. Another problem is that not everyone wants to collaborate. Personal and political baggage can be difficult to overcome, and that's probably true whatever you're doing, wherever you are. But as most of you know, it can also creep into research and conservation work, which is really frustrating when we're all working toward the same goals. Furthermore, some people and organizations are perhaps understandably inherently suspicious of any effort that's perceived as forcing them into a standardization or appropriation of their natural heritage, their species, and their natural settings. So it's really important to be sensitive to this and to find ways to work around it. Another major challenge is that all the goodwill and scientific expertise will only get you so far. Without funding, people's time and resources will be limited. People have donated, for example, a lot to the Consortium for the Conservation of Atlantic Humpback Dolphin, but how long can we maintain a completely volunteer effort? There's a risk that people will need to turn towards paid work at a certain point, and we need to value people's time and reimburse their time for their expertise and the work that they do. Also, it's really, really important to recognize that research cannot create change. Coastal communities, industries, and government stakeholders have that power, and we have to find ways to make sure that we bring those stakeholders to the table, that we involve them in finding conservation solutions, and that we all work together to help preserve these endangered cetaceans. Now, initially, I was only going to talk about challenges to collaboration, to the actual networking. But a colleague of mine who reviewed these slides said, you can't talk about challenges to conservation of these species without talking about gill nets. And he was right. As you may have noticed, in all three of the settings that I described, gill nets in coastal artisanal fisheries present the greatest challenge to conservation of these species. And if we don't figure out a way to help communities fish in different ways, ensure their food security and their income in different ways without using gill nets, which are known to entangle cetaceans wherever they're used, we're likely to see increasing declines and further number of species that tip towards that possible extinction route. But let's try and end on a positive note. And let's think about some of the things that do seem to work when people want to get together and collaborate to protect cetaceans. What I would urge people to do is to be open to the unexpected partnerships and unexpected sources of support. I know that everyone has different feelings about collaborating with industry or facilities that have captive animals, for example. And there is no question that as conservation scientists, we should never allow collaborations to influence the integrity of our work. However, in some of the settings that I described here, support from industry or zoos provided the key to initiating work that might not otherwise have been possible. So I really think it helps to be open to collaboration from all different types of stakeholders and to look for ways to include them in the work. Also, being open to allowing anyone to participate in a collaborative effort rather than taking political sides makes it clear that everyone's welcome, and it can help to overcome some of those reluctancies that I described in the previous slide. I would also encourage people to trust their network partners and give everyone the benefit of the doubt. Sins of omission, like forgetting to copy someone on an email or consult them about a particular issue, are really easy to commit. And 99.9% of the time when someone's left out or overlooked, it's due to an oversight or over-enthusiasm on someone else's part, and rarely due to truly negative intent. People who are involved in collaborations should really try to be as open about sharing experience, expertise, and especially limelight as possible. We need to work to build each other up and support each other's effort and work. In the collaborations I described, having a logo has really helped to create a shared identity and a shared sense of purpose. In a similar vein, having a website can help to create an external face for the collaboration for those wanting to support the collaboration or learn more about it. And it can also be used to share resources within the collaboration. And that's something that we really hope to do with the Consortium for the Atlantic Humpback Dolphin. We're putting resources on the site that can be used by people on the ground to implement their conservation efforts. There are advantages to having loosely organized informal networks rather than complicated hierarchies and organizations. But at the same time, some form of coordination or administrative support is essential to organize collaborations and maintain momentum. Without it, people diffuse responsibility, they lose momentum. And this is a difficult thing because not all funders want to provide financial support for something that's not particularly sexy, like coordination or website maintenance. So it's an ongoing struggle, but it's really a critical component of effective collaboration. And finally, there's nothing that can replace face-to-face meetings to help people learn to know each other, meet each other as individuals, and become friends as well as colleagues. In these times, that's difficult. And so it's important to find ways to move beyond big Zoom meetings and big group emails. And often it can be effective to have one-on-one communications to help foster personal relationships between people in the network. So those are just a few of the points that I wanted to share with you today. I'd like to thank everybody for their patience and listening, and I hope we still have some time for questions.
There you are. Hi, Gianna. That was amazing. Fantastic. From humpbacks to humpback dolphins. In some fashion, it feels demoralizing, yet when I hear you talking about all these collaborative efforts, it's astonishing to me. So that's a remarkable work that's being done. So that is, in a way, you paint, of course, a picture that is very dire, but on the other hand, seeing this collaborative, can you speak to that? So how was it? Is that something that's smooth? It's taken. How long has that taken you to reach that? Of course, it's not just you, but it's all.
No, it's not just me at all. There's so many people involved, and I hope what came through from the presentation is that the process has been different in each setting. So that the people who you bring to the collaboration, the key actors. They're going to be different depending on the cultural and the political setting, depending on the species and the problems that you're trying to solve. And really, yeah, I think that issue of being open is the key one. You've just got to be ready to sort of assess the situation, see who can help, and be willing to involve anyone that can play a role.
Indeed. Let me see if we can get some questions. And I have to really thank all the attendees. There are some incredible questions coming through all day. So we're just trying to sort of weed through some of that stuff. And I apologize. Some of the questions may have been already answered into your talk here. Let me see here. That are coming here. Oh, yeah. Are there any physical differences between the Arabian Sea humpback? I think you talked a little bit about that, just being size-wise, but are there any physical differences that you've noticed in the Arabian humpback population, perhaps even coloration versus, let's say, up in the humpbacks that we're probably more used to in the northern hemisphere?
We noticed slight differences in the pigmentation of the tail flukes. There seemed to be a slightly higher proportion of white-bellied, white ventral surfaced humpback whales in the Arabian Sea, but that's not a definitive difference. It's more the proportions of individuals in southern hemisphere populations versus the Arabian Sea. We also suspect that humpback whales in the Arabian Sea have less barnacle scarring. The Mikolev slide pointed out that there's no cookie cutter shark scarring on the Arabian Sea whales. Those are more factors to do with the fact that these whales don't spend time in the Southern Ocean, so they're not exposed to some of the same parasites and species that Southern Hemisphere animals are. But in terms of sort of physical differences or anomalies, we haven't documented any yet.
I see I see a few questions that obviously speak to the population size currently for the Arabian humpback whale. Do you have a number of that? You think you mentioned that too as a population? Yeah. So just basically the population size currently that's known, or is it a?
So we think there are fewer than 100 individuals off the coast of Oman, but it's only off the coast of Oman where we've been conducting dedicated cetacean surveys and photo identification. So there's a bit of an unknown factor of how many whales are habitually using habitat on the other side of the Arabian Sea. We don't know. We know that one whale, Luban, crossed from Oman over to India, but none of the other of the 15 whales that were tagged off the coast of Oman performed that same kind of migration. So we don't know how much movement there is. There are a lot of unknowns, so we don't know how big the entire population is yet.
Mm-hmm. Another question here is how have you involved fishermen or fisher in monitoring and conservation? So I think maybe I'm paraphrasing it here, but just trying to how do you get involved? I mean, that'll be, of course, they're stakeholders in this whole thing, obviously.
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the areas where all three of the collaborations that I talked about, there's still room for further progress there. But in Sarawak, there are local ecological knowledge surveys being conducted, fisheries surveys. So the students there have been interviewing fishers and learning about their habitats. And then the next step is, or their habits, their fishing habits and what their perceptions of the dolphins are, how frequently they catch dolphins accidentally. So the next step is going to be working with them to trial some solutions. Maybe putting pingers on their nets, maybe giving them more tools. A lot of them in Sarawak sit just a few meters away from their nets while their nets are soaking in the water. And a lot of them report catching dolphins alive in their nets and reaching them in time to be able to disentangle them and free them. That doesn't happen in a lot of gillnet fisheries. In many gillnet fisheries, certainly in Africa and in Oman, the nets are set overnight, and so there's never going to be that opportunity for direct intervention and live rescue. So there are other ways to work with the fishers. In Pakistan, there's been an amazing example where the fishers themselves decided to set their gill nets 1.5 meters below the surface of the water because they thought it would be a more effective way of catching a different species of tuna than they had been catching previously. And they actually noticed that entanglement of small cetaceans decreased, and that's been well documented and statistically proven that setting their nets lower in the water reduces bycatch of small cetaceans. So fishermen really can play a really critical role in helping to find solutions. They don't always need to be lectured at and preached at. They can be part of the solution as well.
Yeah. I'll probably shift just to looking at the time. I'll shift to questions more on the humpback dolphin. Of course, that is something that is. I was shocked too to see this. Of course, after the Fakida, after the Baiji or two, just to have another species, and there probably more species that we'll find out are in dire straits. A question here from could you define some of the concrete conservation measures that should be taken to protect the Tuzii? I don't know how to pronounce it either. I think it's Tuzii. Teutz, I think, was the German name, but that's that Kukenthal had. But anyway, that's. But yeah, what are the concrete conservation measures that should be then taking place? What are your?
Yeah, well, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? So bycatch is the biggest threat, and we know that, but we also know that fishing is a hugely important source of food security and income for these coastal communities. And so the really frustrating thing is that for gillnets, we haven't really found the silver bullet for how to cut down bycatch in gillnets. And so there are lots of different approaches that need to be trialed, and the consortium is actually working with the IWC's Bycatch Mitigation Initiative, and the expert panel from that Bycatch Mitigation Initiative will be starting in Congo and working with local communities and fisheries there to trial different mitigation methods. We've also recommended a number of different things, working with governments to look at environmental impact assessments for coastal construction projects, giving them better tools for how to assess EIAs accurately and to know what is going to have a negative impact on the dolphins and what isn't. And one of our first steps is going to be trying to engage some of those governments in range states to make them more aware of the species and the threats and what they can do to more carefully assess the kinds of developments that are taking place and what the impact may be.
Yeah, well, of course, I seem to remember too all these wonderful stories of fishermen cooperating with dolphins of Mauritania, I believe. those were probably obviously more of scenes. Then we'll take that into obviously looking into different gear types, and those are kind of discussions. I fear that going through the whole day here, we'll see a common theme where fisheries interactions is an enormous problem worldwide, global. So. Sort of looking at the time here now, Gianna, thank you so much. And I apologize for some of them, couldn't get all the questions in. Wonderful questions been asked. Your talk has been absolutely wonderful because it touched on so many things. It also touched on developing countries, how they, I found this very encouraging that they're so passionate about helping and doing their bit. So, I'd like to sort of talk to my own board as well to see where we can help your organization and organizations, fellow organizations too. So this is, to me, I'm really sort of jazzed about this whole thing. So Janet, thank you, dankjewel. Thank you so much. We'll move on to the next speaker. So I'll have you disappear. I'm sorry, that sounds to be rude. But thank you so much. I really appreciate that. So good.
Thank you, Ugo. Take care.
Thank you,
Thank
Gianna.
you, everybody.
Wonderful. Good.
Bye.